So important. We have even noticed that when you have your vaccine, it reduces the complications that you may develop related to COVID-19. It shortens hospital stays. It keeps people out of the hospital to begin with. So this is a safe vaccine. This is an effective vaccine. And if you have not received your primary doses as well as your booster, I encourage you to get those vaccines as soon as you can. The next slide is mask. And so we have a lot of questions related to mask. I'm just going to give you some highlights on choosing the correct mask to wear, and this is from the CDC. First, the CDC recommends that if you're going to wear a mask, make sure that it has at least 2 layers. We have become very fashionable with the mask, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in your fashion, make sure that your mask has at least 2 layers to it. The surgical masks that I see some of you are wearing, the surgical masks are built with 3 layers, so they give you that protection. But if you decide to wear a cloth mask, make sure that you have at least 2 layers to give you the protection that you need, and this is coming from the CDC. When you wear your mask, make sure that you cover your nose and your mouth. I don't know about you all, but when I see people in the community, sometimes they have the mask over their mouth but not their nose, over their nose but not their mouth. That's not good enough. We want to cover our nose and our mouth. And then we want to make sure that the mask fits snugly. So on the sides, you don't want to have any openings, any gaps on the sides, if you can avoid that. And then lastly, the CDC recommends that your mask has that wire around the nose so you can press and it fits snugly around your nose so no air can get in or out. Okay, so those are 4 tips when you're selecting a mask that give you the best protection that you can get, okay? Let's go to the next slide, and this is my last slide, testing. Testing is very important. As you all know, home test has become just the new fad right now. We can't keep them on the shelves in the stores. Testing is very important with this Omicron variant to know your status. If you look at the presentation on the left, it says diagnostic. This is your PCR testing. This is a test that it usually takes a couple days for us to get the results back, but this test is very accurate in determining your status, positive or negative. On the right is the antigen test. This is a rapid test. This is a test that you usually get back in 20 to 30 minutes, depending on your clinic. This test is good, but is not as accurate as the PCR test. So I encourage you that if you do get tested, make sure you know which test that you're getting. The PCR test is a very accurate test. It may take a couple of days, but it's accurate. The rapid test, it's not as accurate, but you get your results back sooner, and you know your status sooner.
Dr. Pauls, you have the option here on the mic. I got a low for you. You good?
Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to give honor to God, to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, my best friend, and to the pastor for inviting us to do this, and to my colleague here. And with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So he just kind of touched on COVID, and I like to sometimes reflect on the fact that not everything has been bad about COVID. So I remember seeing something come across my phone, went down the rabbit hole, but it was a good rabbit hole. And it was talking about how people in China had not seen birds in like forever. And this is in the beginning of the pandemic when things were really completely shut down. So there was no pollution, et cetera. In Venice, they were actually seeing dolphins come back. And with respect to mental health, everybody's talking about it now. Now, I don't believe that it wasn't there. I just believe that a light was shined on it by COVID. And so now people are kind of saying it's almost making it okay. So if it was ever a good time for you to go in and get some help, or to at least think about it, I think this is a really good time, because now it's not carrying the stigma that it was previously carrying, if you will. And so what else is kind of going on now that I think is getting people's attention? And so when you look at the first slide, these are kind of different times. When I was growing up, you know, I remember them talking about the return of Christ, and I remember having a teacher in the 8th grade. I don't even remember how we got on the subject in that class, but she said, oh, all these Christians been saying Jesus is coming back as long as I can remember. And she was an old crotchety woman. And she said, and I think they'll be talking about it after I'm gone. But you know what? There you go. And God is getting our attention now. You know, if you take any of these incidents individually, not a big deal. But you put it all together, and if you didn't believe it, you ought to start. But it can also kind of really, if you are not a believer, if you know nothing about the word, and even if you do, it's kind of really making people a little anxious. You're starting to see some depression more. People could kind of cope a little bit when this was thought to be temporary. You know, this is the United States. We're going to come out of this. And here we are, still going on. And so then I see so many different responses to this. You see people acting like we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And then you kind of can also have almost the other extreme where, you know, people are just literally paralyzed by fear. So I hope to kind of get us in an in-between stage here. So we have the usual stresses that's going on during this pandemic that have not gone away, obviously. And then you have the pandemic. And for some people, while certain things have been better, hence why you had the great migration, people haven't gone back to work yet. And some of them don't plan on going back to work because they realized how stressed out they were and decided to make some changes in their life, even if that meant selling their houses, downsizing, whatever. I can't go back to doing what I was doing. But then there have been some negative things. So I do child as well as adult. So if children are being abused or women are being abused, that actually went up during the pandemic when we were really at home, because normally those people can escape to school or to work, and so they couldn't do that. So that's been an added stress there. And then wars and rumors of wars right now. Russia and the Ukraine and. Natural disasters, you know, really? Hurricanes, I'm just like, good Lord. It's like it's a factory out there, just churn them off. Fires. At one point, it was like you look at the West Coast to the East Coast, from the north to the south, and everywhere in between. And then let's not talk about the love of many waxing cold. I don't even like driving anywhere, truly. And then don't look at the news at night, and I'll tell you, you know, look at it enough to know what you need to know, but don't really focus on it too much. If you aren't depressed, you will be by the time that's over with. So you have people shooting each other for no reason. Road rage here in the area is just out of control. This pandemic, to me, it can't be described as anything other than spiritual because it makes no sense what it has brought out in people. Okay, if you don't want to be vaccinated, fine. And right now, I don't care if I, you know, forgive me, but I don't care if I offend anybody tonight. Healthcare workers are tired. And if people don't watch it, then I don't have anybody to take care of them. People came out of retirement to take care of people. Now you have people leaving in droves because we are constantly being badgered, belittled. I was just in office yesterday. I don't really supervise my residents. Fortunately, most of what I do now came at a good time as teller. But when I'm supervising my residents, I mean, people will just like completely ignore us. So this lady had her mask off, and my resident says, when I came back in the room, resident told us that, hey, we need you to put your mask back on. She acted like she in here. And my patience is about that long now, psychiatrist or not, because it is policy for UTMB that you wear your mask. If you don't want to vaccinate, fine, but you need to wear a mask. So I said, ma'am, I'm sorry, we really need you to put your mask on. She rolled her eyes, looked at me. you have a choice. If you want to be served, you're going to wear your mask. If you don't, then we need you to step out. And we'll, and we try to be nice. We'll offer you a televisit, but it's just, I don't really care. I'm going to do what I want to do, how I want to do it, and if I put your life at risk, I don't care. And people don't realize the impact of why hospitals can be so overcrowded and how that may impact you. Because when you have a heart attack, and it's not from COVID, beds are filled up, and you can't even get to the hospital to get treated. There are definitely people dying, and there will be people dying from things that we can clearly treat and are survivable, but there's no beds. So, to go into, I'm not going to read all of this. I just want to read like bits and pieces of just of these scriptures, and you can look back for your own reference later, Luke 21, 7 through 28. But I'm just going to read the very last part of that. People will be terrified. Well, let me go back up. I'm sorry, just a little bit before that. And there will be strange signs in the sun, moon, and stars. And here on earth, the nations will be in turmoil, perplexed by the roaring seas and strange tides. People will be terrified at what they see coming upon the earth, for the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then everyone will see the Son of Man coming on a cloud with power and great glory. So when all these things begin to happen, stand and look up, for your salvation is near. So I say that to say, despite the fact we're in different times, I'm encouraged. Because every day that we go by is a day I'm closer to seeing my Savior. Now, whether that be in death, whether that be him rapturing up, I hope it's rapture, but I'll take it any way it comes. And I think we should be encouraged. Nothing that is happening right now did not catch God by surprise. So I say that to say, yes, we're living in different times, but we have hope as believers. So let's look at the next slide. Definition of mood. Mood can be defined as a pervasive and sustained emotion or feeling tone that influences a person's behavior and colors his or her perception of being in the world. So sometimes I will tell people it's kind of like wearing rose-colored glasses. It really does, in a bad way, kind of change the color of the world around you. So sometimes people will then say to me, well, how do I know if I have depression? A lot of people may feel sad. And so that next slide basically tells you what we look for, because contrary to what people tell you, we still do not have a blood test. We still do not have a brain scan that will tell us that you have depression. So it's still going to be a diagnosis based purely upon symptoms. All right, and that's difficult for us for psychiatry sometimes, because on the one hand, while there tends to be a stigma, particularly in African American community, in Latino communities, in Asian communities, I guess about the time I came out of training and started working, it started kind of being a little swing the other way. And you said East Texas, that's where I used to practice for a number of years. And so the people who weren't as swift would come in and eventually, tell us a bunch of stuff and then say, where can I get the crazy check? So it isn't always carrying the stigma. And because people can read and look up these signs and symptoms, they can, try to fake it. But basically, of these things that are there, you have to have at least 5, and it has to be in a 2-week period at least. And usually by the time people get to us, it's been going on a little bit longer than that. And then you have to have, of those 5, at least 1 being either depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure. So this is depressed mood nearly every day, almost for the entire day. That word anhedonia means loss of interest. Things just aren't fun to you anymore. If you do it, it's still, you can't seem to enjoy it. So either you don't have the interest or you can't enjoy it. Decreased appetite with weight loss, or you might have increased appetite with weight gain. You can see insomnia, but you also may see what we call hypersomnia, which is instead of not sleeping, having a difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep or waking up too early, you will sleep all the time. Psychomotor agitation or retardation. So this basically means that you're kind of real restless and fidgety. You have a hard time sitting still when we're talking about agitation. Psychomotor retardation is you just are just kind of like a lump on a log. you just have a hard time getting out of bed, you don't want to get up off the sofa, you just don't have any energy to do anything, which brings you to the next one on that list, feeling tired, having no energy. Feelings of worthlessness. So you don't feel very good about yourself, or excessive guilt, you think everything's your fault even when it's not. Concentration, you can't focus on things. And then suicidal thoughts, you want to die. And so then we have all other little criteria that say you can't, be using drugs or things like that, or you don't have some other type of condition that would be causing this. All right, so next, definition of anxiety. A diffuse, unpleasant, vague sense of apprehension, often accompanied by autonomic symptoms, such as headache, perspiration, palpitations, tightness in your chest, mild stomach discomfort, and restlessness, indicated by an inability to sit still or stand still for long. So the next slide talks about, well, how do you know whether this is normal or not, right? Because we all can feel a certain degree of anxiety at times, and not all anxiety is bad anxiety. So normal anxiety, it's going to usually be mild, very brief. It's often situational. You should get anxious and nervous if, you just saw an accident or almost had an accident, or something situational, such as you have for us in medicine, you have an exam coming up. If you don't have some anxiety, that can be a bit of a problem, because anxiety often motivates us. And anxiety, when I say things like, kind of don't want to look dumb and fail a test, or you don't want to, do bad on things. So in that case, it can be motivating, which was that last statement. So then let's talk about when it becomes pathological or problematic. So in that case, it's going to be moderate to severe. This is more long-term, and it's going to be very debilitating. It's going to interfere with your day-to-day functioning. So what are some common anxiety disorders? Because people talk about having anxiety. Generalized anxiety disorder, that's when you're a worrywart, is what the main thing that patients will say to me. I'm just a worrywart, or people call me a worrywart. Those people worry about anything, everything, there is nothing good or whatever. They can't even stop worrying at all. Panic disorder with agoraphobia. This is having panic attacks. Some of that was described earlier, chest pain, shortness of breath. You truly feel like you're dying, but they rule out everything and you're not. Now, agoraphobia, that's a big word that basically just means you have a fear of either really open places or extremely closed-in places. So these people have a hard time with concerts, crowds. Think of it kind of almost as a claustrophobia. They really have a need to get out and escape, and they can't very easily. They can really see it sometimes. They may not have it any time other than going on a plane or a train, elevators, driving in cars, going over bridges. Social anxiety disorder or social phobia, this is where these people have a hard time in groups. Sometimes it's so bad they can't even make their own order at a restaurant. They're worried that you're scrutinizing them. They're going to say or do something dumb, stupid, or embarrassing. Okay? So, why do people have psychiatric illness? There are a couple of different ways that we look at this when we're seeing you in psychiatry. This one is an older way, but to me, it's an oldie but a goodie. So biologically, that means when you hear people talking about, my grandpa had it, my mama had it, my whole family have, so it's genetics, okay? So most often than not, you have some type of biological genetic predisposition for depression or anxiety or whatever the case may be. Also, though, biologic covers when your parent or your mother was pregnant with you. There are certain things sometimes, particularly this is the case with ADHD, but also can be the case with anxiety. Let's say if she smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, those kind of things will increase risk of certain disorders. But also, let's say she was abused in pregnancy. Even if it wasn't physical, even if it was a lot of verbal abuse and she's constantly on edge and very anxious and nervous, that does impact the baby. Then your own substance use. And that includes, one of the biggest things when we're talking about anxiety, East Texas taught me this too, is coffee. I no longer ask people, or let me say specifically caffeine, I no longer ask people, do you drink caffeine? I say, how much? East Texas taught me that, not asking that. I mean, people would tell me they drink a pot of coffee a day. I'm like, do what? And they're wondering why they're having panic attacks. You may not even have true panic disorder. You just have caffeine intoxication. Okay? So that is also falling under that biological one. So then we also look at psychologically, because all of these things come together to produce one picture. So let's say you grew up in a household where your mom was real anxious and nervous. You know, if you watch little kids, they'll, pretend like they're cooking. They mimic everything you say or do, including things you don't want them to pick up and mimic. And one of those things sometimes is how we process things, how we act, they learn all of that as well. So there's learned helplessness, there's, learned anxiety, nervousness. If mom is depressed all the time and dad's depressed all the time, they kind of, all these things can be picked up as well. If you had a very impoverished upbringing, if you grew up in a home that there was drugs and alcohol and whatnot, if your parents abandoned you, whether that was mother or father, as a kid, you're taking that in thinking that you're worthless. Why would my mother leave me, or why would my dad leave me? So all of that combined with the potential genetic predisposition. So let's move to social. Social is going to be those things that are just as it says, social. For kids, that's bullying. So your dad left you, and your mom used drugs in pregnancy, and then you get to school and you get bullied. You can't really escape all these negative things. Or even as adults, if you're living in poverty, racism, sexism, all the isms really play a big factor in this as well. And so then to the next slide, then there is the spiritual. So churches, it used to really kind of bother me that if you have diabetes, if you have cancer, I shouldn't say nobody, because sometimes they do tell you, stop your insulin and don't get your cancer treatments. But for the most part, nobody's telling you to not do that. But boy, if you bring up that you're depressed or you're having anxiety or panic, you just need to trust the Lord. You don't be going to those doctors and you just need to trust the Lord. You don't have a relationship with the Lord. Well, the same God, can't you trust God for your diabetes? And here's the thing. I know God heals. Sometimes he's going to heal supernaturally, but other times he's going to heal through doctors. Luke was a physician. And if you don't get it supernaturally, don't think God doesn't love you as much as he loves the person he did supernaturally. He has a reason and purpose behind everything he does. And his thoughts are so far above our thoughts that if I'm in a position that I need some healing, I take it any way it comes. So, though, if he doesn't do it supernaturally, then what? And so that often leaves believers, if you're struggling with this, on the secular side is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But on the spiritual side, you need to get close to the Lord. You just need to go fast. You just need to go pray, blah, 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 blah. Then you'll hear people say, well, it's the devil. So I do believe some things are completely biological, this stuff that we just talked about. But make no mistake, and some of my colleagues would probably think I just, need to be on the other side of the desk, but there is a spiritual component at times. I went into psychiatry, and I don't tell a lot of people. I said the last thing I was going to do was psychiatry. I said, they're crazier than the patients. I did. And at that time, I was going through medicine. We were just getting to where technology was catching up so we could see inside the brain and see what was going on. Before then, it was, if you had schizophrenia, you had a cold mother, and, Freud had, we were basing all these theories on, not that he wasn't completely wrong, but he was an opium addict. So my mind couldn't wrap around that. And so I definitely said I wasn't going into psychiatry. Make a long story short, my first rotation. Me and my roommate were so excited because we weren't going to be on call, and it was Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and I walk on the unit. This is a forensic psychiatric unit, which means these are criminally insane people. And a person walks up to me and says, "I'm going to kill that nurse over there." I was like, Jesus, whatever you do, make sure he's not my patient. God has a sense of humor, because guess who was assigned to me? And they told me, when I told them, that man said he's going to kill somebody, they're like, yeah, he's attacked every woman he's ever come into contact with in the past 20 years. I said, Jesus, did you not hear that? Long story short, I got a chance to lead that man to Christ. Now, he still had a biological illness going on, but one of the nurses looked at him and said, that's the best that he's ever looked in the 20 years he's been in and out of here. I told him, I said, it's Jesus, because you already told me that he hit every woman he ever came into contact with. But what he told me was, he said, the demons get quiet when you come around. And so what I told him was, brother, that ain't me. That's the Jesus that's in me that's walking up in here. So what he said was, I want whatever you have. I said, well, it's a free gift. We had all this free time on the unit, so I don't force my faith. But if they bring it up, it's open, open game to me at that point. So do I think some of this is spiritual? Absolutely. The Bible even talks about the spirit of heaviness. But the Bible also talks about the spirit of infirmity. So that means that some of what you see, diabetes, seizures in particular, we saw where demons convulsed people. And then there are times that there's just truly, just the biological of epilepsy or convulsions. And the bottom line is, when Adam and Eve sinned, sickness and death became our reality. And that includes psychiatric, everything potentially malfunction. Okay. So the next slide says, so you think you're the only one, but guess what? You're not. You're in good company. If we look at Elijah, let's go there real quickly. And again, I'm not going to go through these scriptures in detail, but just to kind of touch on some of this. So Elijah says, we'll look at just 1 Kings 19, verse 4. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord. Been there, done that, bought the, T-shirt. He said, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. He was suicidal. Now, you know what was amazing? He had just had a big victory before this. And yet, right after that, because, Jezebel said, I'm coming after you. I'm going to kill you. He was depressed and wanted to die. And this is one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament. Well, let's look at David, a man after God's own heart. Let's go there. So, Psalm 6, 5 through 7. For the dead do not remember you. Who can praise you from the grave? I am worn out from sobbing. All night I flood my bed with weeping, drenching it with my tears. My vision is blurred by grief. My eyes are worn out because of all my enemies. So this man was crying all night long. He was being chased. He really went through some things. That wasn't just a little bit of sadness. Let's go on over to Solomon, his son. Let's go to Ecclesiastes. And this is 2:17 through 20. So I came to hate life because everything done here under the sun is so troubling. Everything is meaningless, like chasing the wind. I came to hate all my hard work here on earth, for I must leave to others everything I have earned. And who can tell whether my successors will be wise or foolish? Yet they will control everything I have gained by my skill and hard work under the sun. How meaningless. So I gave up in despair, questioning the value of all my hard work in this world. Now, if that's not depression, and maybe a little bit of anxiety, when I die, I don't care about who gives my stuff. I mean, I care to some degree, but my family lately makes me not care at all. I'm just like, you know what? It's not mine. You're not going to care after you leave here. You won't have access to it either. But he was sitting up worried about who's going to have his stuff and what they're going to do when he worked real hard for it and they might blow it. Let's move on to Job. So let's look down at the bottom of the 3rd chapter. Talking about anxiety. Now, he probably had a little bit of depression mixed in with anxiety, and who wouldn't, with all the things that he went through. But he said, I cannot eat. This is verse 24 for sighing. My groans pour out like water. But this was interesting to me. What I have always feared has happened to me. What I dreaded has come true. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest. Only trouble comes. Now, when you think about everything Job went through, do you really sit down and think and wonder, like, is this going to happen to me? He says everything he's feared has happened to him. And some people, when I'm seeing people in the office, I mean, these are the kind of things they tell you. They worry about something happening to their kids. They worry about something happening to their spouse. They worry about something happening to this. They worry they're going to lose their job. They worry all day long. Generalized anxiety disorder. Now, should you think this was just limited to men or limited to the Old Testament, let's jump to the New Testament and hit a female there. So this is Martha. So we're going to go down to verse 38. This is Luke 10. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me. And I laugh all the time because I swear this is me and my sister. Because she'd be at the Lord's feet, not being there having to do all the cooking and cleaning. Jesus, don't you see her? Make her get up and help me. But the Lord said to her, my dear Martha, isn't it interesting? He even told her, you worried. You are worried and upset over all these details. There's only one thing worth being concerned about, and Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her. So these were some great people in the Bible. And if they suffer from anxiety, if they suffer from depression, why do we think we're any different? And there they had Jesus right there with them, and he's right here with us. But, you know, we're not physically looking at Jesus. And if they had all of this with physically looking at him. Come on. So the next slide says, the struggle is real, y'all. But I say so is Jesus. So what now? The reason why we look at all those different whys is that we also want to look at addressing all those areas. So if you go and get help and we evaluate you and we find that you have a particular type of anxiety, depression, etc., there are a couple of different ways that we might look at this. If it's really, really mild, because a lot of people are very, afraid of medication, we might not look at medication. Therapy, we're going to almost always recommend, even if we think medication is necessary. Because usually there's something going on. Very rarely do I just see somebody come in with a pure biological disorder. But there are some issues that usually you need to work out, or you've trained, your brain has been so used to thinking a certain way for so long, we want to train your brain. It's almost like exercise, and you have to train your brain to think differently. So biologically, medication. We have a lot of medications out there now that can be very helpful. And then there's all sorts of other things coming down the pike as well that's not just medication. But that's the mainstream thing right now. Psychological therapy. Now, even though I'm all for therapy and I am about medication, I will say, be careful, because I'm not going to tell you that everybody in my field is who you should be seeing. I will tell you that probably in my department, most everybody's atheist. So you do need to be careful about who you put your mind in their hands. That being said, some people can still treat you if they're not downright all the way to the other side. You can also, and we'll talk about that, talk to your insurance company if you're looking for a therapist and ask for a list of Christian counselors that take your insurance. And it's usually a good idea to start that way, because otherwise, if you're trying to look for therapists and counselors, or even psychiatrists for that matter, they may or may not take your insurance. And then you have to find that out and then start all over again. So it's better to start with who's on your list and then go from there. Socially, control what you can. Family, friends. I tell people all the time, family you're born into, but by golly, I get to choose my friends. I'm not dealing, you want to be able to help people, but some people don't want to be helped. And they just full of drama every time you talk to them. And lately, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of drama going on in the world, but some people it just goes on and on and on and on and on, or they just are constantly mistreating you. Now, it's one thing, I will stay in something when the Lord tells me there's purpose in it. But I'm not going to stay in something the Lord tells me, I'm just doing it for my own, don't cast your pearls before swine. Okay? Stress. Minimize stress where you can. I have to laugh because the Lord knows I'm not quite right, so he deal with me that way. The other day I was just, going through a bunch of stuff, and I too long to go into about how when I moved here and having to wait for my house there to sell, it's always a process whenever I've moved. But in the course of living in two different places, sometimes the weather would change, and then I don't have enough clothes, the right type of clothes. I don't have time to go back to Waco because I was living there for a while, even though I'm from the Houston area, because that's where I was working. And then I love to shop, so I had all these clothes. And then, after a while, when I finally moved into my house here, then it's got all these clothes, and Lord said, you ain't just blessed yourself in the stress, haven't you? Because sometimes we can do that. You can get things and acquire things, whatever your poison is, and then you complain to the Lord about how he's, you stressed out. And sometimes we can do something about that. Limitations. So you have to learn to set limitations and learn how to say no and be okay with that. Now, people aren't going to always like you, and that includes in the church. Because you know what they say? No matter what church, no matter what denomination, across the nation, about 10% of a church congregation, they're going to be the one to tithe, they're going to be the one to serve, and that can really wear those people out. And so it's the temptation to say, and forgive me, Pastor, but if Pastor come to you and say, I really need you to do this, or if you're looking at the need, you want to fill those needs. But then before long, if you keep saying yes, you're needing to go see a psychiatrist or a therapist because you have stressed yourself out. So what I tell people is I have to stop and pray whenever anybody asks me to do something. Because I know even if I'm kind of somewhat overextended, if the Lord has called me to do that, he's going to bless the thing he called me to do, and he's going to take care of me in the process of what I'm having to do. But now when I start going off on my own, even if I'm thinking I'm doing it for a good reason, still, the Lord has to bring me back in and say, did I tell you to do that? Because there's a time and a season for everything. And part of that is rest. And if you're not getting enough rest, your anxiety, your mood will get worse. So sometimes you have to know when to say no. If you have kids, they have all these activities and events, and you're trying to take them to every single one, and then you got your own stuff going on, and you got to put some limitations on some things. So control what you can. Then spiritually, what can you do there? Put on the whole armor of God. Really go through what that means. Especially nowadays, you better know Jesus. Because see, it's kind of getting so ugly out there right now. It's starting to separate out who's playing. I don't know if, one of my favorite scriptures about again, because I'm just not right sometimes. Me and a friend of mine used to just die laughing. This wasn't funny. It really wasn't, but I'm a person that I can be kind of visual. But when the 7 sons of Sceva decide they want to go and try to cast out some demons, and the demons say, Jesus, I know, Paul, I know, but who are you? And then beat them so badly that they left the house naked. I'm imagining all of this in my mind. And that was just hilarious to me. Put on your whole armor and don't play with this thing. Because Satan ain't playing right now. He knows his time is short. So it's getting real. You have all sorts of authority that God puts in your hand and control, but if you're not really laying before the Lord right now, you better be on your knees every day and asking him to protect you every day and putting on the whole armor of God. I'm all for medication, all for therapy, but some things, we got to do spiritually too. It takes all of this and some. So your options for treatment. You don't necessarily have to see a psychiatrist. It's so ridiculously hard to get in to see us because we are in very, very, very limited supply. So you can see your pediatrician if you have a kid, family medicine doctor, internal medicine doctor, if you're an adult. That's a lot of times where some of you are going to start anyway. If it's just minor or a mild to major depression, mild anxiety, they have enough training to do that. That's one reason why I do collaborative care with family medicine and teaching their residents how to manage psychiatric care. They see as sick of people in psychiatry, in family medicine as we see in psychiatry. The wait list to get into UTMB is ridiculous. You're talking about sometimes a year or two just to get in to see a psychiatrist. Then if you have insurance, because there's such a shortage, so that you will know, because it's important for you to know, like in this area, if anybody even comes out of training and decide to stay here, within about 6 months, they've gone to cash only. What does that mean for you as a potential patient? So you can still go see them, but that means you have to have the money now to pay out of pocket, which could be about $300 for an initial visit, maybe more. And then you have to pay for the follow-up visits. Now, then you go and you bill your insurance to get reimbursed for that. The problem is, if the doctor takes insurance, it's about 80% your insurance will cover, and you only have to pay about 20% on a copay. If they don't take any insurance, it automatically changes that in most cases to what they call out-of-network, which means when you go to get reimbursed, you're only going to get 50% usually instead of 80%. And most people, even if they're doing okay, they're still kind of working poor. So that's a lot to ask for. A few of them take insurance, but not very many, because that's how big the need is, they can do it. So then that, again, kind of leads you to your PCP. You can go to MHMR, but usually they're going to be taking Medicaid and people who have no payer source at all. We talked about private practices. CPAN, TCHAT, those are things, I don't have to really tell you about CPAN because that's really more for the providers, but TCHAT, if we're talking about children, and you're in Texas City, definitely for Galveston for sure, there's money that's been given from the state of Texas to kind of help address this gap to some degree. Now, this is truly a Band-Aid in every sense of the word, but it's better than nothing. So you can go to your school's counselor and say, I want my child to see a psychiatrist. They give you a packet. You have to fill that out. And then one of my colleagues or a couple of my colleagues are doing this. And so then it's UTMB. We will see usually your child for about 4 to 5 visits. So we do an initial eval, basically just long enough to figure out what's going on, kind of try to treat them, get them stable, and then send them back to their PCP. Now, at some point after the PCP, if 6 months down, a year from now, you're still on the wait list and they're not doing as well, they can go back, get another 4 to 5 visits. So that's another option. And then we talked about insurance, asking Christian counselor, for Christian counselors and Christian psychiatrists. So let's end with the last thing, that's 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things have become new. So why am I saying that? This is a new year. We want to do some new things. We want to let God do some new things. So if you have been struggling with depression, or you know someone who's struggling with depression, anxiety, or any type of psychiatric illness, ADHD, whatever it is, and don't think because children are children that they're not suffering. I kind of have two thoughts on this. And suicide is going through the roof, by the way. And we're talking about for kids, particularly African-American kids, Latino kids. I'm just kind of shocked. And if you didn't see it on the news maybe about a month or two ago, a 10-year-old, we're also seeing it go down younger at age. And this was in Utah because she was being bullied. She was African-American and had autism, and she killed herself. You see, kids now have access to the internet, which tells you how to do it right. Now, the other kind of thought I have about this is that we've kind of not prepared this generation. When I was coming along, I mean, like, I remember my mother used to always tell us, she'd tell me, she'd say, it's always going to be somebody prettier. It's always going to be somebody smarter, so deal with it. And she was right. And you had to learn how to, and she was there to kind of help me work through those particular things. There were no participation trophies then. I learned far more from my failures than I ever did from my successes. Tell me about learning how to trust on the Lord. I thank God I didn't say it right then and won't say it tomorrow if he sends me through another deep trial. But truthfully, I thank God for those trials. I'm like Andre Crouch on that, telling my age. Because my relationship with him, I would never know him to be the God that he is if I had not gone through those things. But we have made things so, you know, as African Americans and what we have been through, I can't tell you how many times I heard people say, I want my children to never have to go through what I have gone through. But I also heard a pastor say that the journey sanctifies the ego trip. It keeps us humble. It keeps us understanding that we're dependent on God for everything, including your mind and your mental health. But we haven't prepared them for that. So when this pandemic hit, I mean, kids were losing their minds. And parents weren't there to really kind of now try to help them put the pieces together. This is very stressful. But if we were really helping kids all along, I think we wouldn't be in the place that we're in right now. A resource, a good friend of mine and some other of his colleagues wrote Mind Matters. It's a resource guide to psychiatry for Black communities. A nice little book that doesn't use any medical jargon and really just breaks it down for all these different psychiatric illnesses that are the main things that we see. It tells you about them, tells you like when you need to look to go and seek help, etc. With that, I'll end. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. Now, we are armed with a few questions that we definitely need you to address.
All right.
Thank you for a great presentation. You know, when I was coming up, my grandmother always told us that we weren't grown. We're growing, and you're always learning things, so you're growing. You're not grown.
Amen.
So I thank you for that great information. You know, when I was coming in, some people asked me some questions like, what is depression? What is the definition of depression? And when will you know when you're not depressed anymore?
Okay. And that's a good question. So what is depression? We kind of covered that in one of those slides where we're actually looking for those specific things. And you need to have at least 5 of them. And it needs to have gone on for longer than 2 weeks. It can still get tricky, though. Let's say your mother just died. Okay, you might have all of those things, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have major depression. It is normal to feel sad And by the way, people want to come to us and say, can I have a Xanax? Because my mom died. No. But it hurts. It's supposed to. I lost my mother, and that was one of the most awful things. I lost my dad. That was terrible, too. And every part of you wants it to not be so. But if you short circuit that grief, you can end up with some problems. Now, sometimes, though, doctors will call grief, oh, that's just grief. They used to put a time limit on it and say, up to this point, it's grief. And then after this, it's depression. We now have learned there really is no time limit. I will tell people you probably will have periods of crying and sadness for at least that first year. Why? Because you got to go through the first Christmas, the first Thanksgiving, the first everything without that person. Okay, but it's also a lot of icky stuff that goes along with when people die, if you're very close, if it's a spouse or if it's a parent, you got all the financial stuff that goes along with it and, whatnot. But even if it's 2 weeks after they pass and we're expecting you to be a little bit sad, if a person's saying, I want to go join that person, I'm going to go take some pills or I'm going to do something to go kill myself. Now we don't care if it was yesterday. We're getting a little bit more concerned about that person. They need to see someone. And you need to be concerned about them if they're your loved one. When will you get better? So one thing that can be difficult for patients, because we're in the microwave society, if you have a headache, you want to take something and you want to be gone in a few hours. That is not the way depression medication works. So most of the medications we use, antidepressants, we're talking about 4 to 6 weeks before you start seeing some effect. You may see something in about 2 weeks, but 4 to 6 weeks, and some of the studies now even showing really up to 3 months before we see the full effect. But if at about 4 weeks on a decent dose of medication and you're only about 50% better or 40% better, then we're probably going to be bumping up meds till we get to a therapy, well at the top of the dose, as long as you're not having side effects. But you should feel at least about 70 to 80% better. They've really been getting on psychiatry over the years because we've probably let people remain at a point that we shouldn't have let them remain. Probably more like about 50, 40% better, because the medications honestly just haven't been enough to really completely do it all. But you should start feeling better when you can get back out doing things, where you have an interest in doing things again and not feeling as sad.
Okay, another question. Years ago, I saw a psychiatrist. After my visit, I was very disappointed because I expected a quick fix. Can you enlighten us on what should be expected from a mental health visit?
Another very good question. So your first visit is going to be kind of just a lot of information gathering. I was laughing with one of the residents the other day saying in family medicine that, when they come to y'all for the first time, y'all going to cover some basic things that you kind of have to know. But with psychiatry, we kind of got to cover a lot of stuff. So if you bring your child to me for ADHD, I still have to ask them about all these depression questions. I have to ask them about all anxiety questions. Why? Because if they go out and kill themselves, they're going to say they just saw a psychiatrist and all you didn't ask them if they were suicidal. So we got to cover it all. So that first visit is going to be very long. For an adult, it's going to be probably about 45 minutes to an hour. For a child, it should be about an hour and a half, but sometimes in the real world, insurance companies, they really cut that short. So it's really more information gathering. We may or may not look at recommending medication because people are needing to, they've waited so long to get in, and by that time are really needing to get better fast. We're probably going to look at starting medicine if we think it's warranted in that first visit. Follow-up visits are usually going to be anywhere from 20 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on where you go to be seen. But expect that this is going to be a process, because again, usually what causes you to be depressed is not just biological. If you're having some issues at home, if those issues at home, because sometimes people will come back, I have to deal with residents because we go into medicine because we want to help people, and sometimes they'll come and present the case to me and say blah, 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 and the patient isn't doing better or the child isn't doing better. And so I'm going, okay, so what's your plan? Well, I guess let's increase the medication or let's change the medication. Okay, if you're being abused, if you're a female, you're in an abusive relationship, I don't have a medicine that's going to make you feel better. If a child is being abused, don't have medication that's going to make you feel better. So if, understand this is a process. If those things don't change, a lot of times medication isn't going to help.
Okay, is it okay to be okay? And then the second question, when should you seek help?
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about what you mean when you say, is it okay to be okay?
That was just the question, is it okay to be okay?
Anybody here ask that question? Okay. I'm not exactly sure what they're asking. So if you're saying, is it okay to be okay?
Wait,
Like,
let me rephrase. Is it okay not to be okay?
okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah,
All right.
Is it okay not to be okay? And when should you seek help?
All right, it is definitely okay to not be okay. And usually, other people may be pointing things out to you. Because sometimes when people are depressed, it's been such a gradual process that they don't even recognize it themselves. And definitely once you get on medication, you may not be noticing that you're doing better. Because people, for some reason, think that, oh, they're going to feel something when you get on an antidepressant. I really don't want you to feel anything. Gradually, you should just start noticing, oh, you know what, I thought I wasn't really doing better, but I am able to do this. This or that is improving. So you shouldn't really feel anything. But if you're not doing well, because the flip side to that is, you see the commercials where they're wearing this mask, deep down inside us you're struggling to really make it, but you're putting this mask on. You don't want people to know what's going on. And so we say, don't suffer in silence, get some help. And that's where sometimes it's actually advantageous for you to see, let's say, your family medicine doctor or your internal medicine doctor. Why? Because people are worried about people knowing you're going to see a psychiatrist. You walk into your family medicine doctor, nobody knows if you're going there for a headache, going to get your booster shot, vaccinated or whatever, so nobody has to even know that that's what you're going in there for.
What are signs you should look for when a person is suffering from mental illness?
So depression, we've talked about what you may notice with that. I will say with suicide, when people are suicidal, things to kind of pay a little bit more attention to is if people start giving stuff away, if they're not very future-oriented, just really seeming hopeless. When you don't have any hope, people, that's a dangerous place to be. Anxiety, we've kind of talked about that as well, but people usually kind of almost don't recognize it, almost becomes norm. It's like, don't pay attention, she's nervous Nelly. But it can be very crippling. And sometimes when you're around people who are really anxious, it almost just bleeds to you. You can almost feel their anxiety. And, we laugh about it, but it really isn't funny. Sometimes they can't, it's impacting their ability to get their work done or to even keep a job. If you're just constantly having to worry, that is tiring and time consuming. And letting people know that, you can get some help, or at least just go talk to the doctor. See if, the doctor may disagree with me and think you're fine, but go see somebody.
Okay.
And by the way, where she's getting the microphone together, there are more serious illnesses, obviously, when people are hearing voices, talking to them, or seeing things other people don't see. Substance abuse is super, super difficult and prevalent, and can also look a lot like everything we've talked about.
Good afternoon,
Good evening.
Dr. Falls. I have two questions. Why is it taking so long, 2 to 3 years, some people tell me, 1 to 3 years, to see a psychiatrist?
Good question. Initially, just like me, people weren't necessarily interested in going into psychiatry. And I think it was a couple of different reasons. To go into psychiatry and to see people with problems, you got to have your own stuff together because it will bring it to the surface. And so doctors, we're not immune from having problems like anybody else. We're not immune from being raised in dysfunctional environments. And so it's just something that people kind of don't want to deal with. I don't know exactly how to wrap their hands around. Or also a big problem was that we go into medicine to help people. And so years and years ago, it was kind of, we weren't doing a whole lot to see people feel a lot better. So people weren't going into it. It also wasn't a super high paid specialty. Now psychiatry has become real sexy. Everybody want to do it. And so even though the interest has grown, we're having tons of medical students now want to go into psychiatry. We have so few psychiatrists that it will still be years before we have enough to meet the need. And then when you talk about child psychiatry, it's even worse. We have very few people going into child psychiatry right now, at a time where child psychiatry, kids are really suffering. And part of that has to do with, everything can be about the dollar. Child psychiatrists used to make much more than general psychiatrists, so it was a motivation to go on to do the extra training because it's a total of 5 years versus 4 years after you get out of school. Now we can make about the same thing, or they can do just as well, sometimes even more, in general psychiatry. So it really comes to just, it's not enough of us. And what's even scarier is that the ones that say, if we're looking at Texas, not only is it a shortage, but the majority of psychiatrists are old, which means they're going to be retiring very soon if they don't die in that position, and it's going to be even more of a shortage. So it's really just as simple as there's not enough doctors to provide the service.
Thank you so much. You've basically answered my second question.
But she has one more question she didn't ask.
Okay.
During COVID, she lost her psychiatrist, and meds are totally off. How do you get help when you know you need help, and there's nowhere for you to go because you don't have a doctor, and your medication is off, and you're almost in a manic state?
The best answer I could probably give you is to go to your primary care doctor. I know he probably hates to hear that.
That's right.
But honestly, that's about all that's out there, because they do get training in medical school, and then when they go into their residency, they get additional training, some more than others. But they can at least fill your medication, and most primary care doctors they understand what's going on. So they're kind of used to having to manage this. I do something called CPAN 2 days a week, and it's Child Psychiatry Access Network. And that's, again, something we're trying to do. The state of Texas is providing money to do that. I'm available. I have to be just ready to call them back within 30 minutes of them calling. And they're PCP, so it's pediatricians or family medicine docs call and say, hey, I have this kid in the office and we need it. It's just not very much out there for adults. But I have this kid in the office, this is what's going on. I have to listen to what they tell me. I tell them what to ask, what to do, what to say, and then I tell them pretty much what to do, which is just a Band-Aid. But they're feeling like it's better than nothing. But for adults, it's just not a lot out there. But your family doctor, internal medicine doctor, can usually give you medications until you can get in to see someone else.
You're exactly right.
I mean, psychiatrists now, I just saw one of my colleagues sent, which we kind of laughed at, that we're supposedly some of the top paid doctors in the country. As a matter of fact, doctors now are supposedly some of the highest paid professions out there. But it's going to take a while because, I mean, it's not all about money. Another reason what's driving students into thinking more about psychiatry is we tend to have a better lifestyle than the rest of medicine. But it's going to be a long time before the people that are going into it now, those numbers show in real world ways.
Again, thank you very much.
You are so welcome. Let me add to this. If you get an appointment with a psychiatrist, you better not miss it. And I'm so serious about that. People will kind of take it kind of lightly. Oh, I'll come in. You better keep it. Because a lot of places, what they do, you go right back down to the bottom of the list. So if you have to have a really good reason for them to look at trying to fit you in somewhere else.
So when the manic is so bad and the medication is not being followed, is there anything that you can do in the immediate for help?
So we're talking about a bipolar patient
Yes.
who is in a manic state, very severe state.
Yes.
Okay. Is the person willing to get treatment? Because usually when they're manic, they think they're
Yes.
fine.
Yes.
Okay. Is the issue that they don't have anybody to prescribe the medication, or?
Prescription's been done. You're in a state, and medication is not just being followed through.
Okay. So sometimes what we use, which if they're really severe and if they have any psychotic features, meaning hearing voices, seeing things, may not be enough, some pills, but they do have injections. A lot of the medications that we use that are now FDA approved to treat schizophrenia as well as bipolar disorder come in injectable forms. And so it doesn't depend so much on the patient having to be willing to take the medication, or some people really truly forget, especially when you're manic. You may just even forget to take the medication. So that's where injectables help.
Thank you.
But usually your regular internal medicine doctor or family medicine doctor, they may not be able to do, I mean, they're technically able, but they probably don't feel comfortable managing, they feel okay with pills, but feel a little less comfortable when we're talking about injectables. So now you're talking about MHMR to do that. Okay, and if someone gets really, really severe, you can also always call MHMR if you think they're to that point that they're a danger to themselves or someone else, and that will get them into services sometime sooner if they're going to have to be hospitalized. And you can call 911. They will send, a mental health deputy or someone to the home to evaluate and potentially hospitalize. Won't get you in if you're fine, and or you just depressed or just bipolar and you're stable. But if it's emergency, it will. I'm sorry. Right. So, to be honest, and that includes with us as psychiatrists, what I will tell people is kind of like with cancer. We've come a long way with treating cancer, but some cancer is going to be still lethal. We've come a long way with treating depression, but some depression is still going to be lethal. Depending on people's circumstances, sometimes you're just not going to know, and there may be nothing you can recognize other than seeing that all of a sudden, if they've been really low and they start feeling just really happy and there's nothing in their circumstances that's changed, sometimes that means that they have finally, because sometimes it's a struggle for people to actually kill themselves. And then once they finally make up their mind that they're going to do it, it's a relief off. And so then that might be a sign. But honestly, sometimes it's so subtle if you're not in their everyday space. And then other times what we will tell people, sometimes when people commit suicide, they were fine. And what you didn't know is they happened to get a phone call. Or they happen to walk in and find their wife or husband with someone else. And people don't often know about that and may never know what was the real trigger. And sometimes they don't leave a note because I walked in and I saw XYZ. Those kind of things you may never know. You may hear about if they got fired from the job and then they went home and killed themselves. But sometimes it's just not anything you can tell. You look for those things that we talked, that's in that hand, you know, on that particular slide that talked about if people are just kind of moping around. You say, hey, come on, let's go such and such. No, I'm good. I'm just not feeling it today. But if they're hiding it, it's not a whole lot sometimes that you can do if you're not in the house to really see changes. Look for weight loss if they're not, or look for excessive weight gain. And another reason why you need to, this is another important thing, because sometimes people are just so focused on the psychiatric aspect. You need to go to the doctor because sometimes it is not psychiatric at all. I can remember when I was doing my training, I did it in Louisiana, and I can remember having to go to the ER, and this was what sounded like just a basic panic attacks, and this person was, panic attacks were so severe, they had become suicidal, and a lot of times people don't understand that as psychiatrists, we are medical doctors, so we have to deliver babies, we have to be in surgery, we have to do everything that everybody else did. It is just a specialty of medicine. And this is why it's important for us to be trained, because when I looked at the young lady, I was like, okay, something doesn't look right about her eyes. But they were pressing us in the ER to hurry up and get her to the floor. And it was wintertime, so she was all bundled up. When she unbundled, I looked at her neck, and I'm like, oh, man. Her blood pressure was through the roof. Her pulse was through the roof. But they expected that in the ER because they're thinking it's a panic attack. And sometimes the ER docs are in a hurry. They want to clear the ER, kill the ER. And she was in what we call a thyroid storm. She didn't have panic attacks, just as this panic disorder at all. She purely had a thyroid issue. And so sometimes you can end up dying from thyroid storm, and you're just thinking you're having severe anxiety. You need to get to the doctor because it may not even be anything, and once they treat that problem, the panic attacks go away. And it can affect malfunction of your thyroid, can affect and cause depression. There are other disorders that can really mimic and present like psychiatry, and it's not. And if you never go to the doctor, you'll never know that.
So, Dr. Falls, if grief, divorce, family dysfunction, and all those things can trigger mental health issues. We're saying all of those can trigger it, correct? Mm-hmm. And there's a shortage of psychiatric help. There's a backlog. You can have your child to go to a counselor at the school. Does that backlog still affect those children from getting the assistance that they need as well?
Absolutely. It's worse, it's getting worse for kids because there are less child psychiatrists, even than there are general or adult psychiatrists, which is why they're really pushing some of these programs where you can go to school and they can get you plugged in with a psychiatrist for those 5 visits, but it's even worse for kids.
So mental health being something that's at the forefront, especially during this time of pandemic, addressing it, acknowledging it, and you're still on the back burner.
And you may still be on the back burner. Also, while we're on it, when you're looking at COVID-19, he talked about, various different signs and symptoms. Long haulers has been one of the scariest things for me about COVID. And what long haulers is you recover from COVID, but you're having symptoms that last long after the illness is over. And one of the things that has come up in long haulers is mental health problems. People are having depression that never had depression before. And it's not just because you had COVID. It really is something new. Memory problems, almost like an Alzheimer's type of picture, because the virus does cross into the brain. And when it does, sometimes it leaves some permanent, lasting effects. So, it's raised yet another issue for mental health, as if we didn't already have enough. If I tell you every day, I'm hearing that we need help. It's not enough, and especially since I work with family medicine. For people, that's one reason why I kind of do what I do with family medicine, is trying to train them so that they really can really fill in more where psychiatric services are concerned. But I'm also there because if you come into family medicine, UTMB, and sometimes they'll come in for toe pain and they get in there and they're suicidal. They're like, what? And then I'm there. I just step in and do an impromptu psych eval. I manage and help them manage it while they're there, to teach them what to do when they get out on their own in private practice, but also to help fill that gap.
Sure. Sister.
MHMR departments? Because I know Mainland Center used to have one, and UTMB had one. The severely mental patients, they had graves, and they decided to close those up, and people still need help.
Okay, so I think you're referring to is inpatient care.
Yes.
Okay. So, a couple of things. Psychiatrists cost a lot of money, but we make none. We make very little, I'll say it that way. For the longest, insurance companies could get by without paying equal. If you have chest pain, they pay a certain amount. Psychiatric, they paid hardly nothing for it. So there have been laws to be passed to try to create what we call parity, where psychiatry gets paid at equal, rates. But it can still be kind of challenging to do that. It's also very long, chronic care, and it's expensive care. So inpatient hospitals, it's very costly, hard to manage. Insurance drives everything. Some of the people I know that do inpatient kind of don't like it, and some of them are getting out of it because, for instance, back when I was in training, we could admit somebody to the hospital, might keep them 2 or 3 weeks because it might take that long. But nowadays, sometimes it's as crazy as if you're not changing something in the medication every day, they only pay for each day that you're making a med change. And we already know, as I've told you, we're not generally going to see that kind of improvement that quickly. If you're psychotic, yeah, those things, even though they take a while, you'll see people kind of tone down on their psychosis with some of the meds we use for that. But for depression, suicidality, it's hard. So it's hard for them to get you to even be able to keep you for a week. Now, with UTMB, that was different. They didn't close the unit. They lost the unit in Harvey. No, I'm sorry, not Harvey. What was the one? Ike. So the unit was destroyed. Because they were in Graves. When I did my training, they were in Graves. But then they moved from Graves, and we had Rebecca Seeley, where that was where we had the unit. Then they were working on, we had the new facility coming up on the island, and part of that was going to be a psych hospital. Then there was a fire. Then we had another hurricane. So it's been getting kind of, just been all these things that's coming up, but it's still there. They're still working on finishing that whole facility, and I don't know when it's going to be now, when it will be finished, but they will have an adult unit again. Child, no. They decided not to go down the pathway of having an inpatient child psychiatric unit again. And I was just talking with some colleagues on the way here because that presents a problem, because if a child goes to the emergency room, needs to get admitted, and there are no child beds, let's say in the Houston, Galveston area, then the child is sitting there, and sometimes for days. I have colleagues down in Corpus that, they've called me to kind of help them with these kind of issues, because then the ER docs are saying, what are we supposed to do with this? We're ER docs. Why are we having to, how are we going to keep a kid in here for 4 days or 5 days and we don't have anywhere to put them until a bed opens up? That's how bad it is. What, for inpatient? because we have nothing in UTMB was it. So when they lost that unit in Ike, until this new unit is finished, there's nowhere else but Houston. Now, you know, if you overdose or something like that and you end up going into, you know, UTMB now has facilities in Clear Lake. I have to do some of the call there for child. They may have us come and see you as a consult to kind of help them manage you until they get you into a psych facility. But just to go straight to psych, all that's there is you know, Houston until the unit is finished in Galveston. And it's not that they're not trying, it's just been, you know, kind of one thing after another that came up. So Rusk is a state hospital. And a lot of times that's where people are going to go if, let's say, they've done something criminal. For instance, a lot of you guys might be familiar with, let's say, Andrea Yates. Okay, so she's in Rusk State Hospital, and people are under the mistaken impression that she was, you know, oh, she got off easy because she, you know, ended up going to a psych hospital. Not so. I mean, like, she's going to be there pretty much for the rest of her life. And at the time that she did what she did with her children, she was not in her right mind. Then you go into a state facility and now you're medicated, and now all of a sudden you're made aware because you're clear enough to realize what you did. That's a punishment, I promise you, for the rest of your life. So Rusk State Hospital is more for that type of long-term patient care. When Ronald Reagan was in office, he decided that, you know, they had to make some cuts, not good ones. And so those long-term, so you used to have a lot of facilities like Rusk State Hospital. And they were for people, because like some people that are really psychotic or severe bipolar, we can have them on the injectables. We can have them on the unit for like a month and they still don't get any better because they're that severe. And then those people are targets for drug dealers or whomever, and they get on drugs, which makes it that much worse. So you can't expect everyday people to try to be able to take care of their son who's, you know, an elderly woman who's trying to take care of her 30-something-year-old son who's completely out of his mind even when he's on medication. So they used to have facilities that kept people. But what Ronald Reagan said, and this is not about politics, this is just, you know, I'm not saying Republican, Democrat, I'm just saying what the facts were. So basically they said, look, we got to cut, this is costing too much money. So they closed all of those facilities just about. You still have like Rusk State and, you know, a few others. And they basically gave those people a bus ticket to wherever they wanted to go. Now, did they save money? No, because who did they become? The prisons got full. Why? Because those individuals, when they're psychotic or they're really, you know, might have committed crimes or whatever the case may be. So then you just shifted the funding to somewhere else. They became the homeless. And then what we know is that we know a lot of psychiatric disorders are genetic. Now you take a schizophrenic and you pair them with another schizophrenic because they both high. And that child that they have, oh my gosh. And the child, if it's been exposed to drugs and whatnot, a stay on the NICU, neonatal ICU, is outrageously expensive. And this child will likely have mental health issues, so now we're paying for another person going into the system. Didn't save any money, but to them it sounded like a good idea at the time, but now you also have no long-term facilities to really deal with people who are severely mentally ill.
Sister Scott, you have a couple more questions. And once Sister Scott gives us, if there are others, feel free to share. But Dr. Falls has said that once we close out, you can have some post questions. You can approach her afterwards,
Okay.
after the service.
Okay. Well, this question it says, which is best, a psychologist or a psychiatrist? But I want to rephrase that and let you explain to them what the difference is between a psychologist, psychiatrist, and a PCP.
That's a very good question. I remember my mom was a secretary at an elementary school for years, and her principal, one of the principal schools she worked with, he asked her, he said, you knew I was in medical school, and he said, what is she gonna, Lisa gonna end up doing? She said, she's gonna go into psychiatry. I want to tell you what my mom's response was on that. And so he's like, psychiatry, she's not making any money. And so he thought I was going to be a psychologist. So what is the difference? So as I said earlier, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor, just like your family medicine doc is, your internal medicine doc, etc. We have to go to medical school. We can actually prescribe medication, okay? A psychologist is a person who did not go to medical school. They may be called, well, they are called doctor, but for a different reason. They have a PhD and not an MD. Most psychologists, though they can do therapy, just like we can do therapy, a lot of times insurance companies don't really want to pay for us to do therapy when it's too expensive, so you see more psychiatrists doing med management is what we call it, and LPCs are licensed professional counselors or social workers. They're kind of doing more therapy. So psychologists are usually not going to do therapy because they kind of cost a lot of money too. Most of what psychologists do now is psychological testing. So in children, that might be doing psychoeducational testing. In other words, testing whether or not you have like dyslexia or, math disorders, IQ testing for school and that sort of thing. But they can also do other types of tests for adults if you're elderly and they're trying to decide whether or not you're competent to live on your own or whatever. They might do those kind of tests. So they do all sorts of things like that. And that's how we differ. Now, technically, they can't write for medication. We all will diagnose people. But there are some states where they are now being allowed to write medication. That's a big source of controversy right now in medicine. Because there's a shortage, so there needs to be kind of more people, but then doctors are saying, hey, if you just start letting, PhDs start writing, prescriptions, that's somewhat dangerous. So they really do have to go through some extra training. And honestly, by the time they go through all the extra training, they probably should have gone to medical school is kind of the way it works out. And some states have just limited on how much they can write. But if you talk to some psychologists, they're like, okay, we thought this was a good idea. We really don't want to do this. Because as I said earlier, it really is more than just being able to say, oh, you have depression and, because people come in now with Dr. Google all the time and tell me what they need to be on. It's not that simple, because it really is, you need to know more about the human body as a whole. But that's kind of how we technically differ.
Okay, last question. Is psychiatric hospitalization always the right answer?
No. Sometimes there are people, same thing with medication, that want their people hospitalized or their kids hospitalized or want them on medication, and sometimes we don't agree with that. And then you have the people who don't want them on meds and don't want them hospitalized, and that's usually when we think they should go. And every now and then we meet in between and agree. Hospitalization, so let's talk about what or when we think that is the right thing. So we think you need to be hospitalized, whether you're an adult or whether you're a kid, if we feel like you cannot be safely managed at home. You're suicidal, you have a plan, you plan to act on that. Now, there are layers to that we have to kind of evaluate to decide your level of risk. Do you have a history of prior suicide attempts? What were those attempts like? Did you call somebody and tell them after you took the pills? Or did you take the pills and you didn't call anybody, you didn't tell anybody to find you? That's a little bit more serious. Is there a family history of suicide? All these things start increasing the risk and start making us think, hey, we need to get you into the hospital. It's pretty much to keep you safe. Are you psychotic to the point you can't function? You're not really in your right mind. You're not bathing. You're not able to do daily things, and you're hearing voices tell you to kill yourself or to kill somebody else. Again, we are also required by law to protect others. So it can be you're so depressed that you want to kill yourself, or you're psychotic, or you want to kill someone else. Those are reasons why we're really looking at hospitalization. COVID made this really difficult as well, because sometimes you're having people that meet criteria for hospitalization, but if they're COVID positive, they're trying to keep them out of a psych facility, and they can't go into a psych facility until they're not a danger anymore in terms of COVID, because those kind of facilities can just, I mean, COVID can blow up in there. And it's so much that you can't have on a psych unit. They can't have any IVs. They can't have any, because patients can use all sorts of things like that to kill themselves with. So, you know, right now it's kind of, we try as best as we can to keep you out of the hospital because it's still a risk going in with COVID being so rampant right now.
Okay, we've heard a lot of people asking what are signs in, can you give us 4 or 5 signs they need to look for when it comes to mental illness?
That's a hard question when you say mental illness because that's a broad term. If we're talking about 4 or 5 signs of depression, those things we talked about, they all of a sudden, and it's a change from what was previously normal. So they were fine, and then all of a sudden, you notice they're not eating anymore. They're losing interest in things. They're just all of a sudden not wanting to hang out with you anymore. That may happen once or twice because they're having a bad day. But if you're going into weeks, months, and that's still happening and it's getting worse, they're losing weight or they're gaining excessive weight, then you know that now we have a problem going on. Psychosis, sometimes, believe it or not, you don't always know that people are psychotic. Because sometimes it's not just hearing voices, seeing things, sometimes it's what we call delusions. A delusion is a fixed false belief. So they believe certain things, that you're out to get them, you're poisoning their food, you're, you know, that kind of thing. But with hearing voices, sometimes you'll see people just sitting there and they're kind of whispering to themselves and, you know, kind of, that might be a sign that they're hearing voices and seeing things. And then, you know, it's getting kind of where they need to get in to see somebody. But it's hard to just say mental illness per se because, and that's the issue even within itself. Because sometimes people will say to us, why are they on so many medications? Because, you know, this is Texas. People don't really believe in a lot of psychiatric drugs. And it's because of the very thing you said. They kind of look at mental illness as a mental illness, one thing. And what I try to tell people, especially when I'm dealing with kids, you know, we try to minimize, even with adults, we try to minimize how much medication we have you on. But antidepressants, particularly what we call SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, those are SSRIs. They happen to be good to treat depression as well as anxiety. But if you happen to hear voices, not going to treat that. If you happen to have ADHD, not going to treat that. Different medications, so then, you know, people have said, well, why are you on 3 meds? If you happen to have 3 different disorders, it's just like if you have hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, or high cholesterol, whatever. There's not a one pill that's going to fix all of that. And so some of what's in psychiatry is not just mental illness. We have distinctly different disorders sometimes.
Okay, last question, I promise.
It's
Is there
okay.
a difference between mental health and mental illness?
Of sorts. So mental illness, you're specifically saying that someone is suffering from some sort of mental condition. Mental health, it may have mental illness as part of when we're having mental health discussions, but mental health can also be just doing things that keep you mentally healthy. So we may talk and do things on, you know, remaining mentally healthy, not getting to the point that you develop mental illness. We talked about even medication, we talked about therapy. One of the things that they've really impressed upon us more and more, to the point sometimes they recommend that to get the point across in our minds as providers as well as your mind if you're a patient, is writing a prescription. There are other things that go along with helping us feel better. Exercise. We kind of, you know, your doctor will talk to you about that, about trying to get your weight right, you know, if diabetes or hypertension or whatever. But we're finding increasingly that that is super important for mental health. And it's a healthier way to deal with your stress than what some people may do. But sunlight is important for making certain chemicals in your brain that make you feel better. So they might say you need to get a certain amount of sunlight a day. That's why you hear some people, we call it seasonal affective disorder, in places like Cleveland, Ohio. I remember doing some training there, and it's a lot of gray the whole year. You're not getting very much sun. Alaska, certain places where there's a lot more nighttime, and they may go 6 months where it's no daylight. Sunlight is very crucial in keeping you mentally healthy. So it's a lot that goes into mental health, not just, medications or whatever.
You're good. Amen. Oh, when I preached my first sermon, just before I went out, my dad says, you can't tell it all in one sermon. I said all that to say this. We just started a conversation in regards to your mind mattering. And so we won't be able to address every single thing, but just to start the conversation in our community, in the communities of faith, to kind of tear down some of those walls of petition that prevent us from acknowledging that we are dealing with some mental health issues. We wanted to start this conversation, so I thank Dr. Falls, I thank Dr. Gilbert for helping us start this conversation, and it's our prayer that we continue this conversation to address those necessary things when it comes to mental health and mental illness in our community. So again, we say thank you to each and every one of you who come out, who viewed in regards to this symposium. I'm thankful to God for your commitment to come out and share with us, for your in-depthness in your conversation in addressing our questions. We're grateful. Let us give them a hand as we make ready to leave this place. And again, so Dr. Falls, we're still good. Somebody can catch you post on the
Absolutely.
way out of here.
Absolutely.
Feel free to ask your questions of her as we make ready to get out of here. Let's have a word of prayer before we leave. Again, God, we say thank you for allowing us to be in presence of individuals who are professionals, who are able to share and to address those particular needs that are concerning to us. Now we're making ready to go down from this place, but not from your presence. Grant traveling grace and arriving mercy to our various destinations. We pray our prayers by faith. We believe them to already be done. It's in the name of Jesus that we do pray and ask it all. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.